I'm going to read to you a chapter today from The Rise and Fall of Mount Majestic by Jennifer Trafton. Illustrations are by Brett Hellquist, in which a flying hat has dire consequences. Chapter 1. On a dark night in a dense forest, while the great, wide wonder of the stormy sky threatened to burst through the trees and swallow her up, a girl lost her hat. This would not be an event worth recording in the annals of history, except that the girl not only lost her hat, she lost her head, which is to say, she panicked. When a gust of wind swept off her hat and sent it flying above the trees, she left the path she had been so carefully following to run after the vanishing blue speck. It is not surprising that when she finally recovered her head and sat down to think, she realized that she had now lost both her hat and her way home. Out of the clumsiest moments of our lives, time can weave the most extraordinary tapestry of events. Who would have guessed that the fate of an entire kingdom depended upon a gust of wind, a flying hat, and a girl losing her way in a forest? Certainly she did not know what was to come, and on that night she imagined herself to be the most miserable person in the world. The girl's name was Persimmon Smudge, which only added to her misery. She was 10 years old, and 10 whole years of living with that name was already too much. As far as she knew, only one person named Smudge had ever managed to be heroic, and he had disappeared. Persimmon angrily kicked a stone, which, unfortunately for her toe, remained in place. "It's all Prunella's fault," she cried. "If she hadn't pestered me about sweeping the floor right in the middle of my glorious dream about rescuing a baby from the teeth of a murderous alligator, I would never have thrown the broom across the room. Then the broom would never have hit the giving pot, and I would be here trudging through the willow woods in the middle of the night to fetch a new pot from Theodore. And with a storm coming, too." She shivered, not so much from the cold as from the thought of her mother returning home in the morning to find the giving pot and the new hat gone, not to mention her daughter. She could just imagine her punishments. No more trips into town, no more afternoons sneaking out to the seashore, nothing but chores. She would end her life as a shriveled old woman surrounded by brooms and darning needles and mixing spoons and rags. Doomed, all because of her sister, to an everlasting existence of sweeping and dusting and stirring and mending. She could hardly bear the thought. That's why she had run straight for the path to Theodore's cottage in the first place. If it was a choice between braving the woods at night or braving her mother's anger, well, she would take her chances with the woods. Braving the woods at night to save the family from a slow, agonizing death by starvation did have a heroic sound to it. Well, maybe they wouldn't exactly die of starvation without the giving pot, but they would certainly be very hungry. But then her hat had blown away, and with it all of her heroism. It was a large-brimmed blue hat with embroidered fruit all over it. It looked more like a drowning apple tree than a hat, but she loved it. Usually she felt invisible. A poor girl with worn-out clothes, a forgettable face and hair that was neither golden yellow, nor chocolate brown, nor fiery red, but rather like dirty dishwater. People didn't notice her, but they noticed her hat. It made her feel less smudge-like. All at once, the sky burst through. White streaks of lightning lit up the blackness that had gathered over the trees. Thunder made the ground tremble. A sudden downpour drenched the willow woods. Persimmon jumped to her feet, holding her arms helplessly over her head. She was angry and afraid and hungry and wet, so she did the only thing she could do. She started to dance. She leaped and spun and flung out her arms. Her bare feet skipped and slid and squished in the mud. "Take that, you thunder!" She kicked her heels high. "Take that, you storm!" She twirled in circles until she was dizzy and out of breath, and for fear had turned into laughing. Then she took one last leap into the wet branches of the nearest willow. She clasped her arms around them and swung upward into the night sky. When she swung back, she bumped into the tree trunk, slid down it into the dark, dry space around it, and lay there on the ground, panting. As Persimmon would have remembered if she had been thinking clearly. Disturbing a willow tree at night is even more foolish than leaving a path to run after a flying hat. High above, in the willow's canopy of leaves, two round yellow eyes slowly appeared. A black shade began to creep noiselessly down the trunk. There was a flash of lightning that made the wood suddenly as bright as day, and in that moment, Persimmon saw the tortoise. There had been a time when she was very, very young, and only acquainted with the lumbering, clumsy sea turtles that played with her by the shore, when Persimmon had laughed at the idea of being frightened by a tortoise. A poison-tongued, jumping tortoise? Faster than a human? living in a willow tree? She thought it was another of her mother's tricks to keep her out of the woods and at home. Then she had learned better. There's absolutely nothing laughable about a poison-tongue jumping tortoise when you were standing 2 feet away from it. Crouched at the base of the trunk, it was nearly as tall as she was. Its domed shell of black, bony plates was rimmed with sharp spikes, and its legs were several times the size of her head. The tortoise's eyes were fixed steadily on her, and from underneath its pointed snout slid a long, snake-like tongue, a tongue so poisonous that a single lick would put a swift end to her. Persephone saw all of this in a matter of seconds, and then the night was black again. This was not how it was supposed to happen. She had told the story to herself hundreds of times, lying in her bed with the quilt pulled over her head and imagining that she was the last remaining defender of the town of Candlenut as it was being ravaged by a pack of poison-tongued tortoises. The townspeople, and her mother and sister, and in some versions the king and his entire court, cowered in the background, weeping and crying out, "Persimmone, you are our only hope. Forgive us for thinking you were nothing but a basket-maker's daughter, a nobody, a smudge. Forgive us for ignoring you. Save us, Persimmone, save us." And then she would smile sweetly and walk up to the leader of the tortoises and plunge a knife into... Now she was alone, without an admiring audience or victims to be rescued, without a knife or a slingshot or anything at all to defend herself. Now the woods were dark, and the rain was pelting the ground like hail, and she was hopelessly lost. And even if she was to put up a valiant fight before she died, no one would ever know, and she would never get a new pot from Theodore, or make it home to tell her mother that it was all Prunella's fault. "Don't you dare eat me after all I've been through today," she yelled. The tortoise responded with a hiss as piercing as a scream. Persimmone decided that it was safer to run than to scream back, so she ran through the freezing rain and the darkness, over and under and around what she could not see, except in moments when the lightning lit up the world like a huge candle, only to be blown out again by the wind. The ground trembled under the weight of the tortoise as it jumped after her, plowing through the trees in its way. Bump! Thud! Crash! At last Persimmone spied a large fallen tree trunk, and she sprinted over it and ducked in its shadow, pressing against the soft layer of moss that covered it. To her surprise, the moss gave way behind her. She tumbled backward and suddenly found herself inside the tree. The trunk was hollow like a tunnel, and the moss had been covering a small hole in the side. What a perfect hiding place. If only the tortoise had not seen her. But it had. Its shell scraped against the bark as it scrambled over the tree trunk. Persimmone squeezed farther back into the dark tunnel, just as the tortoise thrust its head straight into the hole and began to come in after her. It was lucky for Persimmone that the shell of the poison-tongue jumping tortoise was so much larger than its brain, and also larger than the hole in the tree trunk. Just as the snapping jaws and outstretched tongue had almost reached her face, the tortoise's shell got stuck and wouldn't forward another inch. Hissing in fury, the tortoise kicked and rolled and stretched its neck as far as it could, but Persimmone was beyond its reach. It finally withdrew in disappointment. But it did not leave. Instead, it sat down right outside the hole, blocking Persimone's exit. "Oh, I should never have gotten out of bed this morning," said Persimmone, forgetting that to be alive and uneaten was a miracle worthy of notice. She waited and waited in the pitch-black tunnel until the sound of the pouring rain was drowned out by the harsh rattle of the tortoise's snoring. At last, she lay down inside the cramped space and fell asleep, too tired even to pout over her misfortune. Too tired, in fact, to hear the faint shudder of a sigh behind her in the dark recesses of the tree trunk. A broom, a hat, a girl, a hole. Such small things in a big world. But without the small things, there would be no story to tell. And, most importantly, I would not still be alive to tell it. If you want to know what happens next, you will have to read The Rise and Fall of Mount Majestic by Jennifer Trafton. This is Christ Center Library's children's pick of 2014.